All right, me. It is the 18th, and yesterday, after substitute teaching, but before rehearsal, but not enough time before rehearsal to film this, I finished reading John Hersey's Hiroshima. This is the second publication of this. The first publication constitutes the first 4 chapters of this. The second publication, made in 1985, is the last chapter. And the last chapter, chapter 5, is, in of itself, is like half the book. And the reason for this is because John Hersey's Hiroshima is a collection of stories and interviews from survivors of the atomic weapon that was dropped on Hiroshima. And going through their stories, right, up from the 10 minutes before the bomb dropped to the first 4 chapters really kind of goes to the first effectively year of their life afterwards. Really it's close to 6 months. And so the first version of this came out in 1946. And then he went back 40 years later, or on the 40th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic weapon, to re-interview families and some of these people that were still alive at that point. Fascinating piece of literature, right? It is this very, very, I don't want to say strange, but it is one of those things of where, within modern media culture, right, the glorification of war, the conceptualization that, oh, we can just drop a nuke on someone, what's stopping us? Our own government making jokes and creating video game graphics to go along with their current war. And right, this is very much a book that is an exploration of what actually happens to these people, right? Which is a shame that there is certainly a great deal of literature, but not popular literature, I would say, that is about these things, right? But yeah. I think the breakdown goes that it goes up until the noiseless flash happens, right? As very much described by survivors. It was a noiseless flash, right? The sound came so fast that no one could hear it. And then, their immediate reactions, then the first couple days afterwards, and then the next couple weeks, right? And it's just full of harrowing tales and harrowing stories of what we put people through just because we could, right? So yeah. John Hersey does make some kind of interesting arguments here, or odd arguments in a lot of ways, right? And a lot of it is comparing the 1940 chapters to the 1980 chapter. And what we kind of end up with in a great deal of things is kind of this mental block, I guess, or incongruity between similar ideas. And so, like, John Hersey very correctly identifies in the 1940 chapters that the immediate reaction by a great number of people, and the great majority of people that he interviewed, of this feeling of misery, but also this feeling of apathy, and their circle of concern being very, very, very small, and not always willing to help or support strangers or even neighbors. Or when we get to, I forget which doctor it is, because there's like 3 doctors that he talks to. But one of the doctors is like this basically only uninjured doctor at one of the largest hospitals in Hiroshima. And he works like 3 days of just attempting to bandage anyone he can. And he works for like 3 days straight with, like, I think it was described as like an hour of sleep. And like, John Hersey very correctly identifies that these immediate reactions were very much based in and around trauma, and that there was such a much larger issue going on, that to care about the bomb in that sense and to really actively think about it was not something that they could do, right? And then we move forward to the 1980 chapter, and we get some statistics from John Hersey that it's like, you know, the Japanese population is 50-50 on whether or not the bomb was humane, and whether it was acceptable in war and things like that, right? And John uses those numbers in a way that is like very much this is fact, and that this is, you know, there's no disputing or any concern about these numbers, right? But certainly I look at it and go, people are still affected by trauma, right? Also, 40 years later, the amount of people that you can actively interview and can actively talk about that have strong memories of the bomb dropping is much, 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 much smaller. And so we are looking at a survivor bias greatly. But also this is still a very traumatic event. And so the thinking of it and people willing to think about it other than just have apathy towards it and not put any effort into it is still very strong, right? And so, you know, there struggles with stuff like that there. There's also a pretty big deal on Catholicism throughout all of this, and part of that comes from, I have no idea about John Hersey himself, but like, he, 2 or 3 of the people that he interviews are priests or pastors, and then you have a couple of people that convert to Catholicism, and so it is just very much there's a lot of leading into that and leaning into that, and that Catholic religious experience and things. But this is a gruesome book. It really is. There is imagery here that is I think very hard to forget, and is a reminder of how terrifying this stuff is, right? And that these are human lives that are here, right? And that they are not games to be played. however much our government wants to imagine that they are. And I think finally, the other thing to mention is that I think it is also pretty clear in the 1980 version that it is written during the era of Reagan and the political climate and before the wall fell and before the fear of communism had diminished, right? Of still living in this world of, we have seen what these things can do, and 40 years later, we are still fighting and still attempting and threatening to use them on each other. Which is the big thing about the last chapter, is that it goes on this monologue in a lot of ways of the history of the atomic weapon and which countries have tested and have used it up to that point of publishing, as well as the growing general fear that exists there, and the ever-growing threat that we're going to use on one another. Yeah, that is John Hersey's Hiroshima.